Okay, good evening and Happy New Year to you all, and welcome to this, the second of three lecture presentation sessions on the rise of low-income renting in Latin American cities. This lecture series is offered by the Latin American Housing Network, the LAN, and it's on a website anchored at the University of Texas at Austin, and it's run in conjunction with the University of Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning. My name is Peter Ward, and I'm a professor emeritus in public affairs and sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm one of the several founders of the Latin American Housing Network that also includes Dr. Edith Jimenez, one of today's speakers. And I'm grateful to my LAN co-editors, Drs. Francisca Bogolaski and Kristine Stiphany, for their management support of the website and for their work in mounting this particular lecture series. The primary focus of the LAN website, the unit of analysis, if you will, are the older established and now consolidated informal settlements that formed 20 or 30 or even more than that, 20 or 30 years ago, and which are now experiencing rising and high densities and see the production of low-income rental opportunities, the subject of today's lectures. An important goal of the multi-city and nine-country study was to figure out sensitive and workable policies towards these consolidated settlements. Please see the video, it's actually in Spanish, on the welcome page of the website for more details about the research strategy, the organization and methodology of this study. In the first lecture last December, Dr. Paula Santoro described the rise of renting in Latin America, in Brazil, and in particular in Sao Paulo. And she argued that the production and management of rental opportunities and services has become an expanding area of profit seeking, especially in the higher and middle income sectors of the residential market and among real estate groups. She also showed how more modest investment is penetrating into informal markets, sometimes encouraged by public sector subsidies and vouchers in support of low-income renters. You can watch a YouTube video of that lecture on the LAN website or from the link from a link on today's poster announcement. Today's lecture takes a more micro approach on the rise of renting in two cities by two scholars who have an intimate knowledge and extensive fieldwork experience of field research in low-income settlements. Dr. Kristine Stiphany is an architect, urban planner, who received a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, where she also held a National Science Foundation grant to extend her work on Sao Paulo. Today, she is an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo and is director of the Civic Data Lab and the CHAPA website. Dr. Edith Jimenez is an architect, urban planner, who received her PhD in sociology from the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, and today is a senior professor and researcher in the Department of Regional Studies in ISER at the Universidad de Guadalajara in Mexico. As mentioned earlier, she's a founder member of the LAN, and over the years she has directed several housing and urban development research awards from Mexico's Science and Technology Council, CONACYT. For further details about both of our speakers and their various publications, please see the links from the poster announcement for today's event. Each presentation today will last 20-25 minutes. We'll take them together, followed by 30 minutes for discussion and for Q&A. Both presentations will be in English and will be recorded. If you wish to pose questions during the presentation, feel free to go ahead and pose them in the chat to everyone, please. Questions and comments may be in English, Spanish, or Portuguese, as will also be the case when we get to the final discussion period. Just please keep comments and questions brief and succinct. So, without further ado, let me invite Dr. Kristine Stiphany to share her presentation on informal renting in Sao Paulo, new or not. You're muted.
Okay, so hello, I'm Kristine Stiphany. As Peter mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University at Buffalo, and I direct the Shapa Civic Data Lab. I'd like to thank everyone for sharing your time this evening, and thanks also to my law and co-editors, Peter Ward and Francisco Bogolowski, for their collaboration on this project. I also want to thank the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Buffalo for their co-support of this series. And I acknowledge that this research was supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about why new modalities of renting exist and how they are stimulated by slum upgrading in Sao Paulo and why this interface is important. So much is known about upgrading, its insufficient scope relative to the global housing crisis, the prioritization of physical change over social empowerment, and that upgrading is ultimately deeply uneven, frequently worsening human displacements and other inequities. In like manner, we know from many years of research that rental is an important dimension, albeit in the past minor dimension, of informal housing consolidation. So less is known about what happens to informal settlements after all of these cycles of unbuilding and rebuilding, whether they're in the context of an upgrading program or at the property building, as Peter mentioned, micro scale. As we've argued together with Peter and I have argued together with Leticia Perez in a recent JPER article, what's really being redeveloped and what we should really pay attention to in informal settlements is, in fact, rental housing. And so to explore these micro forms of redevelopment, in recent work, I focused on Sao Paulo, where for the first time, rental accommodation is a significant proportion, if not major proportion, of informal settlements called favelas. Shaped by general processes of consolidation, rental is also influenced by a new dimension of upgrading, which is a rental voucher-based resettlement program that people displaced from redevelopment project sites use to house themselves. You may say, well, of course, and as Dr. Santoro mentioned during our last lecture, Brazil is following down the neoliberal path of the United States and its voucher system. But the one in Brazil was always initially meant to be temporary. Yet that was 15 years ago, and due to project default on the construction of actual housing units, Sao Paulo's vouchers remain in circulation, radically altering informal built environments, but not as initially intended. As elsewhere, informal rental is not new, and it's another mechanism for co-opting the poor into building their own homes by a state that circumvents its public responsibility. Yet, as the singular resource stream for housing regeneration in informal settlements, one that most have been harping on or wanting for at least 3 decades, I argue that the voucher system could be reoriented to assimilate equitable housing access as well as safety. In fact, this was actually the idea in Brazil from the beginning, to use informal housing processes to synthesize social equity and good housing. Brazil's policy environment has evolved through these successive phases, within which housing was positioned as a catalyst for social and technological reciprocities. And the big idea here is that these reciprocities began with incremental housing processes and models, but that these have slowly transitioned into control by the private market. And this trajectory has veered off the tracks with the Minha Casa Minha Vida mass housing program, as we've talked about in a 2019 article for the International Journal of Housing Policy. And so I've wondered if the vouchers could be a policy practice hybrid, because they channel these resource streams to settlements that the state, because it has embraced Minha Casa Minha Vida, has effectively abandoned. And so this rental housing study is part of a larger comparative analysis of the impacts of these successive waves of upgrading in Sao Paulo, which was funded by the NSF between 2015 and 2017. And you can read more about this study on the Shapa website, www.shapa.io. I draw on a combined ethnographic and mixed methods approach to analyze how rental patterns, which I define as the tenure mixes and physical transformations, vary across settlements with identical upgrading histories. And so to note in this image, Jardim São Francisco and Heliópolis are the only 2 settlements in all of Sao Paulo that share these identical cycles that we saw in the last slide. So in my work, I measure rental as a proportion of the built environment, as opposed to a focus on number of renters in most studies of rental housing. And so the number of sampled housing units have been converted, I look at that, and working volumetric in whole or part for an entire building that can be converted for rental. And you can see a small video that details the methodology and the kind of drawings that we use to study these kinds of very complex built environments and how they evolve on the SHAPA website for a UN Habitat presentation from 2016. And so amid these structural dimensions of urban change, there are 5 patterns of informal rental that planners can measure, and identifying how these vouchers are changing the social physical fabric of informal settlements can help communities, and they can help governments really pinpoint where things are happening. The case differences in rental housing also varies, obviously, by position in the city. And so in the case of Heliopolis, which is 11 kilometers from center, more than 50% of the properties have some kind of rental. Whereas in Jersey, San Francisco, which is approximately 23 kilometers from Centro, around 25% of properties have rental. And so one thing to think about this is what we're looking at is these variations, how they vary lot by lot, and then within settlements. So there are 5 of these different patterns, and what I'll talk about next is what are the old patterns? Like, how is informal renting similar to the past? So one, it's vital, but it's an expanding component of urban housing about which we know very little, because typically rental is embedded within physical buildings. Second, you have these owner-occupied variations in which renting occupies a minority dimension of an overall dwelling. Third, these rental additions, or how rental is built in, is a room-by-room conversion, and these internal subdivisions are mechanisms for essentially building petty economies into individual properties, be they commerce or for rental, and they can be flipped back for family use with very little labor and very little investment. And in general, the architecture of renting and rent is obscured. Okay, so how is rental quite different? So we can see in the Family Plus the first pattern, which is very generally, you have these old patterns of rental. A family may live on the first 2 floors. They use the conversion of rooms within these first 2 floors to then fund a more substantial addition. So here what we see is some old and some new. The first 2 floors are quite old. You have these patterns of old rental, but the second 2 stories are one entire project, which even a decade ago, we probably would not see, at least in the case of Sao Paulo, and even in a dense informal settlement like Heliopolis. You have a 2-story addition, which is a substantial addition, even for incremental housing. Okay, and then in the second type is quite different. You have what is called a family transition. So in contrast to the first type, where the building is evolving vertically over time, the family transition type involves a building that is consolidated quite early on by probably an ambitious family, or a family who has come into some kind of extra money in order to complete their house. And then over time, they downsize their footprint in order to subdivide the building, what is now too large of a building for them, for rental purposes. And so again, you have essentially this shell of a building that was used entirely for family or intergenerational living or sharing, and it has now been converted and often subdivided into smaller units for rental housing. In a third type, the collective consortium is when things become quite new. The collective consortium is typically a project that is undertaken by a group of often non-familiar, can be familial, but often non-familial actors. And they combine their money to invest in something that they could not do otherwise, or not do on their own. In this particular case, and in many of the other these collective consortium types, each floor is owned by a different dono, and then each of those donos rents to their own tenants. One dono may own 2 floors, another may own 1 floor, and even there are two owners per 1 floor. So they're incredibly complex, the way that these collective consortiums are divided up. Another difference between the collective consortium and the first two more family-focused types are that the collective consortium is not linked to any kind of emotional tie to a particular property. These consortiums look for accessible properties where they can essentially flip them into rent as a group. And so this is what we might call a more dispersed or diffusive type of informality that operates across a couple of, multiple different lots. Okay. In the fourth type, we get into what I've termed the signoreo cortizo. Signoreo just means landlord, but it has a bit of a, I would say, not underbelly connotation, but it sort of, it might mean a little bit like a slumlord. So, and a cortizo is a tenement. Peculiarly in Sao Paulo, tenements were historically confined to the city center. They would really, informal settlements, loteamentos and favelas were considered a refuge from rental. And so the fact that this type is now occurring within informal settlements now is rather paradoxical. Nonetheless, the cortizo works through, similar to the collective consortium, works with intermediaries, maybe a family, maybe not a family, who invest in a property and turn it over entirely for rent. In distinction to the collective consortium, which you see a little bit higher quality with the collective consortium, because people do tend to be local, and they do care a little bit about their community. They're there to stay. The signoreo cortizo is what it looks like. It's a tenement, and the goal is to pack as many tenants into these buildings as possible. This is the telltale sign, of course, is the caracol, or the round staircase that can be tagged onto the front of any building to give access to any level of floor. And in the words of one of the residents, a resident who lives next to one of these, they require wings to access. Another interesting dimension of the cortizo to think about is that they work as almost a verticalized backyarding system that was identified by Alan Gilbert and Vanessa Watson in the mid-90s in the South African context. In distinction, in the signoreo cortizo, this works by essentially renting a floor plate on a second or third level. People build their own shacks, and as soon as that floor plate is filled with shacks, the columns are extended and another floor plate is constructed, and the process begins again. So essentially that backyarding process, or what Wegman has called horizontal densification, but again in a vertical dimension. Highly precarious plumbing systems, access systems, egress in this particular type. Finally, we have what is called the duress flip. So if the previous types all dealt with some kind of reformulation or recasting of an existing building, the duress flip is the opposite. It is, it's basically capitalism in its purest form. The actors that are involved in the duress flip acquire properties that are otherwise undeveloped. It's clearly a family who is in duress. They haven't evolved their property to more than one story. And that small shack becomes demolished, and the flippers construct a new mixed-use building in its place. You can see several, this is just a clipping from an area of Heliopolis, but you can see these very advanced buildings that one would see in any formal city context. So the construction processes depart from what we would think of as autoconstruction and move into the realm of a much more organized construction ecosystem. Construction crews build these projects over and over again on multiple lots, highly organized, highly professional, and to boot, the project is typically completed within 3 to 6 months, which means that neighbors often appreciate these types of projects, even though they are at the core a really I would say significant implementation of power asymmetries in favelas. So rental is not just the transformation of a building for developer benefits. So taking into consideration tenant security, one of the things that I looked at after identifying the types is a qualitative assessment shown here, which demonstrates that of the approximately 236 rental units surveyed only in Heliopolis, the majority of rental conditions are poor. So as demonstrated by the last rental pattern, core housing or sites and services housing tends to exhibit the highest quality. They have very regular lots. So for example, for the duress flip, these sites and services lots are the first lots that are targeted for that kind of project because they've already been engineered, they're flat, they are of a regular size. This also owes in part to higher instances of original owner occupation and also the structural regularity of the dwelling unit. So in this case, technology really does matter. But of course, if we look at the spectrum of quality, as shown in the slide, you see that you have significant and very precarious conditions, and then some which are leaning toward interesting and safer conditions as measured by egress, finishing, water, access to potable water, whereas when you're getting to the left, the 30% range for the highly precarious, egress is very cramped. Either there's no egress is via a ladder, you don't have access to water in these kinds of situations. So again, you can see the unevenness in the rental markets in this slide. Finally, it's really important to emphasize that these lot level dynamics, as we talked about in the last lecture with Dr. Santoro, are not just a community phenomenon. Although the rental resettlement vouchers were intended as a temporary measure, this is a decade of rental use, beginning at the end of the leftist Suplicy administration, when it was really used as almost like a recovery mechanism for extreme events, but is transitioned into something much more normalized. And so you can see there was a major peak in spending on rental vouchers with the conservative Urbanização de Favelas program with the Kasabi administration, followed by some use by the left Haddad administration. And so more research is really needed to understand the relationship between these subsidies, the surplus, and spatial production in the city of Sao Paulo, around for future research. And so some of the key insights: rental remains a key channel for increasing access to low-income housing, as it has in the past. Yet, as elsewhere, it remains entirely overlooked by policy. And this is really paradoxical and problematic because Brazil's policy environment was actually set up to support reciprocities between social and technical change. Quantitative and qualitative on the ground in the building measures are critical to understand the after effects of rental. And although the vouchers were launched as a momentary temporary measure, they've embedded a range of conditions to which policy has not yet responded. And in fact, has gone out of its way to ignore it, especially with the embrace of the Minha Casa Minha Vida housing program. To redress unevenness and reorient the rental vouchers, municipalities couldn't impose some soft regulation on where rental vouchers are being applied and how they concretely improve conditions. Within settlements, governments could provide tax incentives for micro developers and regulation incentives to owners. Finally, there are experiments in land readjustments for collective parcel management. So although this model requires testing, particularly the idea that you would do some kind of progressive tax across these different housing types, so tax the perhaps types 4 and 5 more than the family-focused types. These require testing, but it could supplement policy tools for making concrete improvements, channeling those funds into infrastructure improvements in these areas that have not been improved for decades. So as we've argued previously, this could be a way for Brazil and now Lula to loop housing policy back to the building level conditions where, in many ways, the Brazilian planning miracle began. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristine. Sorry, I thought I'd lost you. Thank you, Kristine. Excellent presentation. As I said, thank you also for joining us. There are a number of people who have joined us after I began the introduction. And I mentioned at that time, we're going to take the 2 presentations back to back and then have about half an hour for comments and questions. But at this point, I just want to ask, not invite questions and comments, but any clarifications that anybody has that they'd like to ask Kristine, just to clarify a point from the presentation. It may be a term that was used or a point that wasn't quite clear.
Everything was very clear, they say in the chat.
Everything was very clear. Thank you. I think it was. The only question I would have, the slides of the pictures of the range of types that you had with the percentages above, did that correspond to the types that you talked about, family plus transition collective consortium, or was it just sort of the percentage of within your study?
It's a great question. Those do not correspond. Those are looking specifically at Heliopolis, where, and I should have mentioned this, looking at Heliopolis, where rental is denser or exists in a higher quantity.
Thank you. And when you talked about rental, I know that you're not talking exclusively about residential rental, correct?
Yes,
You didn't
there is some, I mean, in some instances you have commercial, but I was really looking at residential rental. So yes.
Excellent. Any other points of clarification? Okay, well, thank you once again, Kristine. We'll come back to you with comments and questions a little later on. We're now going to turn to Dr. Jimenez from Guadalajara, Universidad de Guadalajara, to present her presentation, please.
Right. Right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm very glad to be here as part of these land lectures. I'm Edith Jimenez, and special thanks to Kristine and to Peter for having me here. I'm going to talk to you about rental markets in consolidated low-income settlements. And let me just change this because it's on the way to my. It's just doesn't let me see my. Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk to you about the rental market in consolidated low-income settlements in Guadalajara in Mexico, specifically looking at housing and policy opportunities. I'm going to talk to you about low-income settlements in these consolidated areas in the city, those settlements that were built in the middle of last century and are now within the city, but they were built in the periphery. And they bought the land, breaking the norms at that time, and now more or less about half of them have legal titles of the property. Well, which are the types of rental housing that I'm referring to? Well, we have rooms, only rooms rented, and then shared the facilities like for washing or toilets. We have tenements, we have flats, and we have houses. These are the basic types, but also we can see here different types, prevailing types that we can find, at least in some of the settlements that we studied in 2009, and they are carry on being more or less the same at the moment. And you can see in a plot on the photograph on the left, you can see the ground floor, the first floor, the second floor, and that's mainly they go as far as 2 floors. Very rarely they go higher, as we saw in the other presentation. We have different types. And one very common is, if you see the photograph on the right, you can see the stairs that go to the first floor. And those stairs are within the property sometimes, and sometimes they're outside the property. The other types of tenements that we can have is the one on the bottom left, which is a corridor in the middle with the facilities in the corridor for washing clothes and hanging them, toilets as well, and then the unit dwellers on the right. And on the right, the photograph on the right, you can see the stairs going to the first floor, and that's more or less the common view on these settlements. Now, what is happening at the moment is in the periphery around these settlements, we can see these towers, quite a few and quite tall, and they are not for renting, they are property flats, and there are more than $1 million pesos, 2 million sometimes, when in the settlement, if you are lucky to sell a house, would be for half that price, so nearly that price, but they don't sell, as we have mentioned in papers that we have published before. There are also enclaves. They are not towers inside the settlement, but they are houses, small amount of houses, like a set of 8 houses within the settlement itself that also are built by companies. In the study that we, just to give you an idea, very rough idea about the rental in Mexico. In Mexico in 2010, it was 20% according to the census. In 2020, it went down to 16.4%, but in the trend in the consolidated settlements is quite different, because it was 30% in 2009, and in the fieldwork that we had last year, yes, at the end of last year, we could see that it was much more. We can see that the age of the household, the head of the household, it was youngish, 35 years. Most of the people who rented didn't have any relationship with the owners. More or less, people have 3 years living in rent accommodation, but they can be up to 10 years as well. The size of the plot is 134 square meters trim mean, and 100 the mode. The average rent is $108 US, and 68 have private contracts, the rest don't. And this is shared with the owner. Only a third of people rent that property that they rent with the owners in different areas, of course. Now, one of the things that we found in last year when we were trying to identify houses for rent or flats for rent is that the way it's advertised, they are advertised, is very different to what we found 10 years ago. We found very few ads, and for instance, for flats and houses, we found none on offer. We see on the right a photograph that says "Se vende esta finca," it's for sale, but obviously because they don't sell, they say also for rent. So in this case, it hasn't happened either of those two things. But what now is happening is that are more ads for renting business and offices and workshops, but as you can see, very, very few in this fieldwork that we did in this settlement. And for selling, there is no flats for sale, no houses on offer, and advertisements that we can see are very few. Well, we can see that what are the reasons for a landlord to rent property? Obviously, we can see that to have an extra income. But the one that I want to stress here is that they rent to survive. Some people rent to survive because there are widows, there are seniors that don't have another income. So it's very important to take this into account. The other one is to split the inherited properties on the same plot, an alternative to selling because it's a stagnant market, as we learned for a long time now. And now, why do people become a tenant. In the study that we made, and I mentioned before, half, a little bit more than half of them rent as a temporary stage for being an owner. That's what they want, to be an owner in the end, but they have to rent for the time being. Other people don't have any plans whatsoever to buy a property for different reasons. And some of them, very few, but it's important to consider that there are owners already, but they have to leave that house where that they own and move to these places that are more centrally or more closer probably to their work. And other people are looking for the social network in the neighborhood, but because they cannot buy a property there, they rent to be close to the people that can rely on. So what I'm trying to say with all this is that rental accommodation is needed, and often it's preferred. I'm going to talk to you about two programs that have been in place these last 3 years. This is one that is to do with the desdoblamiento or multiplication of houses that is carried out by the municipality of Guadalajara, which is the central municipality of the metropolitan area of Guadalajara. The public policy is re-inhabit the city, and that's the main idea, because this municipality is losing population and it's been losing it for some time. Now they want to keep people in the city, and they say that this program might help. Okay, so what is the program proposing? Well, to build or subdivide, support the building of the subdivision up to 3 additional dwellings plus 1 space for business on a family plot for the owner's children. They would help with the license as a condominium. They will also give legal coaching, and they will give tax incentives. That's one of the programs. Now, the other program is to do with the municipality in the periphery of the metropolitan area, and that is to help reducing the number of vacant housing in the periphery. The municipality acts as an intermediary between the owner and the tenant. And in the case of the owner, the municipality signs the rental agreement with the owner, guarantees the rent for a year to the owner, and pays 6 months in rent in advance to the owner. In exchange, the tenants pay, tenants in a vulnerable situation, they pay 350 Mexican pesos, it's equivalent of 18 US dollars, and the municipal government pays the difference, 140 US, or an average up to $94. Now, the problem with the vacant houses in the interest social housing in the periphery is very, it's quite well known. And Guadalajara has 258,000 vacant houses. And the municipality of Tlajomulco is the 3rd municipality with more empty houses in the country, and it's got over 77 empty houses. Now, the impact of the program over 3 years so far is only on 85 houses. So it's a very limited impact. And it's mainly because most of the vacant houses in the social interest developments are in legal problems because of the default. This program was inspired with by programs and vouchers in the US and in Europe. Well, what about this? What are these policies doing to the city and going back to the city, etc.? Well, the government has some aims, and the actions are, well, a little bit contradictory, if I can say that, on their statement. They want compact cities. Most policies state that. They want to promote the supply of adequate housing, avoid the population of the central municipality, and reduce the vacant houses. However, what we can see that is happening in the city is that more towers are built everywhere. And the crucial thing is that no support is given to the densification process done by the low-income inhabitants themselves. So they propose programs that emulate what the low-income settlements are doing, but they don't support what is already being done for 20 years. So that's very important in this view. Now, one of the things that we have to consider with these settlements is the intensive use of an active sharing that occurs here over time. This is an example that I have put before, but it is very good because we can see that in these walls that we can see here is adobe walls. That's what the house began. That's the first construction that they have. All the rest is done over the years. And then when the cycle change and more people go and come back, well, now we have 3-unit dwellings on the first floor and 1 house on top. And over the time, the arrows red going up is the people that go out of the property, and the blue arrows are the ones that come to the property. Well, in this household, along 38 years, we have seen 63 people going and coming in this property. Original couples, parents, children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, godchildren. Some stay a little bit, some people stay longer term. So we have policies that have made life difficult for the government, for the people. The government have made life very difficult for people. If we see this is Guadalajara. This is the central municipality that I've been talking about. This is Tlajomulco at the periphery. This is the ravine here. The city is here. The forest is here. And there are limits for where the city can grow. This periphery was where people normally built irregular settlements. And if you can see all these dots of purple around, we can see that these are the type of settlements, the low-income housing estates that are being built. So this land around the real estates have increased the prices of the land, and obviously low-income settlements are not being able to settle there anymore, except in few places, and probably more in the municipality of Tonalá for reasons that I'm not going to explain here, but that's the problem. So what happened is that if you don't have any support from the private sector, you don't have much support from the government, and also the policies are in detriment of them, then the refuge for people to go and live, if they don't have much income or they need the network, is to go and live in the low-income settlements, consolidated low-income settlements, and even in the not consolidated. But this is the refuge for the renting and sharing of the population. And I want to talk about the problems that they are facing. If we see this photograph on the top left, this is a house, and the house on the first floor, they lost the roof, and there are several rains have made very wet this house, and there is no support for these people. This is a man that lives on his own and has no resources whatsoever. He lives by selling things in the tianguis. One day come, if he sells, he eats. If he doesn't sell, he doesn't eat. But there is no support of any sort in here. And we have, well, the other types that we already mentioned before. So what are these low-income settlements, consolidated low-income settlements offering? Well, it's a sizable niche for renting accommodation. That is very important. It's not a small place in the city or in the metropolitan area. They occupied quite a large area. It is an important alternative for cheap accommodation for young, poor families, widows, and seniors that probably they don't have any other income except the state pension that is not very high. It has acquired now a privileged location because it's with close to public facilities and transport, offers a wide variety of accommodation options, and that is very important. It's not only one. They offer rooms, they offer flats and houses, etc., and provides long, short-term accommodation. And what it's more, it promotes the compact city that the politicians want to promote. So, but it's not all sweet in these places, as we say, as I mentioned with the other house. They face problems because it's an aging housing stock, because they have problems of habitability, functionality, structural problems. They also face insecurity of tenure, and with no formal succession arrangements. So what can be done to encourage housing for renting through the government? Well, they can, to start with, they can legalize the condominium tenure in these places. They can guarantee the rights of sharers and tenants and owners, and not only the ones that get involved with a program that they are launching, provide technical assistance, and there are lots of possibilities, but in one word, we can say, well, support the process undertaken by the people themselves to modify spaces, building new ones to provide new dwelling units. So they're already doing what they want to do, but they're doing it in a larger, much larger scale than the government is doing it now. They can also support housing cooperatives. That it's not done because it's not an easy way to launch them. Rent for very low income population in vacant properties. Get to an arrangement with those people that are default their houses and see if they can make it short or they can use it while it's a long process, but something they have to do with that. And active encourage the administrative succession of property instead of making it through the judicial channel, which is much quicker, cheaper, and, well, quick. So public policies, as we know, can have a great impact on improving the living conditions of large part of the population. But even if we do it and we say it over and over again, nothing is happening very much. And the final remarks is, well, they have to learn that the reality is very dynamic, and the lots are divided, the numbers of houses increase, the uses of spaces change, the number of people living fluctuates, and the property tenure gets more complex every time. Supporting the popular production of housing means supporting owners, temporary and permanent inhabitants of the houses and tenants, and that means supporting around half the population that is not served by the market or the government. It is necessary for the popular housing produced by the inhabitants of the city to be more visible and placed at the center of a housing policy. Renting and sharing are the main options for housing the urban poor. Thank you very much. I'll finish.
Excellent. Thank you, Edith.
Thank you.
Let me just change the view here. Okay, that's great. We have about 35-40 minutes open to us for comments, discussion, questions. So with that, I'll just open the floor to anybody. As I mentioned at the outset, you can, if you're more comfortable speaking Spanish or Portuguese, then please do so. That's fine by us. But the floor is now open.
David.
Hi. Yes, thank you. Hi, Peter. Can I jump in?
Please do.
Thank you. Well, I am David Lopez Garcia. Hi, everyone. I'm postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy in the University of Illinois, Chicago. And broadly speaking, my work is on the links between urban structure and equitable access to urban employment. I appreciate the presentations a lot. Thank you for this fascinating research. And I have a question for both presenters. Will you be able to share information, or have you been able to gather data on the socio-occupational profiles of both the tenants and the landlords in these settlements, and also in these new forms of rental housing? And do you have any idea of where in the city is their source of income? Like, where do they have to go within the urban structure to access their jobs and their economic activity? And how is that process supported by these rental market, rental housing arrangements?
Interesting question. Let's focus on landlords first. I know Kristine has some commentary on the landlords, but both landlords and then the second part of the tenants, where the tenants, their socioeconomic profiles and so forth.
Thanks for your question, David. So we have data on both the landlords and the tenants. The survey mechanism was a combined household survey, so it was a full survey of the socioeconomic dimensions of families living in the house. And then in architecture, what we call it's a very dry metric, but a post-occupancy study of the building itself. And so the team was 4 people actually in one space, which is how we were able to start to unwind rental, seeing, for example, signs for rent on the outside, or simply, we had the survey, but it was really a sort of a mix of both the survey, the post-occupancy analysis, and also an open-ended discussion about, with the resident, whether it was a renter or an owner, about what was actually going on the property. I also had the benefit of, I've studied both of the communities, Heliopolis and San Francisco, for about a decade ethnographically. So I've been in and out of these places for quite some time. And that enabled me to undertake some follow-up studies with landlords and people who are getting into the rental market, who were, for example, in the JAEP piece from 2019, I talk about some of these families who are now in their retirement years, who are using rental as a, they're finally able to stop laboring, and they're using rental as income. And some of them are actually moving out of the favela. So they're hanging on to their asset and they're becoming asset managers versus people who are building all day long. And so when I think about policies and the discussion we just had with Edith's presentation, and some of the things I've been thinking about over the last years are, who are the people we're trying to support? Are we supporting, if we're supporting rental policies at the building level or the property level, or revitalization of buildings, does that include crime lords? Does it include the slumlords, or is it confined to the families themselves? So in response to your question about economics, where are these landlords acquiring money to become investors? I would say one, I think organized crime needs no introduction. I mean, these are money laundering properties. But in terms of the 2 types that I described, the family plus and the family transition, those are essentially reformulating the auto construction process, using incremental conversions of rooms to build up some capital, but then the voucher stream is essentially underwriting their future investment, right? They know that it's going to be coming. So you see the voucher stream, we saw the voucher stream trickling in 2007, 2008, 2009, and people are like, oh, these voucher streams, kind of nice. But, in 2015, it had been a decade of these voucher streams, they weren't ending. So it really has created this snowball effect. There was a symposium in Sao Paulo 2 years ago, and one of the presenters called the vouchers the purse that never stops paying. So it has become, so when you ask spatially where that, employment or where they're getting the money, there is no space to that money. It's really much, it's where the people who are displaced migrate to and seek rental. So it's quite pervasive and dispersed.
Okay. Edith, do you have insights about landlords as well as tenants, where the tenants work and so forth?
Not much. I mean, the people that we talked to more were the ones that were renting very precarious houses, and they lived in the settlement, and they sell whatever they can in the tianguis, but nothing more. We didn't study in depth that angle. And landlords, we identified some that went to work to the United States, and they're renting their property, for example. But I don't know what's the percentage or anything like that, because it was not a study directed to that in particular.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, in fact, some of those landlords who moved to the United States left their kin. Their kin was occupying the property, brothers or parents. And that was actually quite an important infusion in terms of resources to consolidate and to improve the housing. I can remember in 2 or 3 of our intensive case studies, we saw this really quite clearly, and you can follow that up if you wish on the LAN. We have a question from Felipe Antequera. Felipe, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm a PhD student at LBJ School working on rental housing policies with Dr. Peter Ward. Thank you both for these very, very, very interesting presentations. And my question is actually for both of you. If you can give us some insights on what are or what could be the incentives when you are like starting policies like the vouchers, for example, for the landlords to transition from informality to formal, right, contracts. Because what I see in Chile, and I know there are people that are more expert in this, they can add or correct me, but what I see is that sometimes the landlords don't have any incentive to participate on policies such as the vouchers, because they need to go through a lot of bureaucracy, or they need to formalize contracts. And they, in Chile, for example, they get payment from the government on one part, from the tenants. So they see all these, like a complication. So stay on the informality is just more comfortable, and they can just do whatever they want with their, dwellings. And also they have to, they need several like requirements to make the dwelling like a proper, right? Like a proper dwelling, it has to be something, that require minimal conditions, for renting. So how do you see the incentives? How can we work on the side of the landlords to motivate them to participate and incorporate in these kind of policies and programs, especially vouchers?
Thank you. Who wants to take up Edith?
Well, we don't have any formal vouchers in Mexico, except the one that I mentioned, and it is not in the low-income settlements, but it's in the periphery. And the owners there, they have a lot of incentives because they are not living in their houses. They left them and they came back to the city center. So the government said, well, we can rent your house and give you such and such a month. They are delighted to do it. But in the consolidated settlements, there is not a formal program. There is no any incentive to legalize it at all.
Kristine?
Jake Wegman and I talk a little bit about this in our paper from 2020, so I can definitely share this with you. And we've gone back and forth, but I think that the state needs to make some hard decisions about taxation, and I do think a progressive tax could be interesting. So, for example, types 3 or 4 and 5 out of, so you have the slumlord and the organized crime people. The organized crime group has the best buildings, right? They get them done. They use the vouchers they have their own form of voucher that they use for a 6-month period. The vulnerable family goes away, they have housing, and then they come back and they're gifted a 2nd floor unit for perpetuity. So I think it's those kinds of models, that agility that Edith has been talking about, that people have been doing for years. We really need to, at a fine-grained level, begin to use those to guide how these policies are actually implemented. So in terms of incentivizing owners, we could do that with potentially regularization of land, although now most owners don't really care about the regularization of land because the building itself, for the first time, the building actually matters. It's generating so much income that the regular land regularization doesn't really matter. One interesting thing might be public space improvements and infrastructure. So for sure, all of the additional density. We have lots of architects on this call and people who deal with the guts of buildings, all of those pipes and wires and things like that need to be hooked up and become much weaker and stressed the higher that you go. Some kind of program where we can begin to trade, for example, retrofitting of a building, which is not easy, but possible, for compliance, for egress, those kinds of things. So I think it comes in the form of trades and it could be a potential land trust as well. So operating at a block level where you have a mix of original owners who are not in the rental market or yet, and people who are in the rental market. And the improvements from the tax goes to street improvements, lighting, all of these things that upgrading just has not been able to manage and has dropped the ball on, especially in the last decade, over the last several decades. So I would say some trades. That's what I would say. And in terms of the family-focused renting, I wouldn't, they should probably receive the least tax. They've been there the longest. They're the most vulnerable, but also in many ways the most generous. They started out as petty landlords, not necessarily, as we've known since the 90s and early 2000s, that they're not really in it to make money. That's changed now, but they're still not, making these horrible places like, for example, the Señora Cortizo in the slumlords. So I think it's a gradient of trades, and at the highest level, it's taxing organized crime, but also that involves all kinds of other implications that are completely out of my wheelhouse, and that we really need to think about from an ethical standpoint. But so I would say a gradient of trades.
Very good.
The collective consortium is the most interesting model because you're sort of between, there are people who they're not associated with organized crime and they're not associated with family. They're just like people who get together. And so it's a micro entrepreneurial model that I think has the most potential to really both improve built environments, but also create mobilities beyond either just families or organized crime and slumlord types of redevelopers.
Very good. I want to come back to that point in a minute. Sophie Morse has had to leave us, but she said always interesting to consider vulnerabilities that women face in regards to housing, especially single mothers and those experiencing violence. And I was struck when I was going back over Paola's lecture of December, where she pointed out in that there was a, she actually used the term feminization of poverty, which is kind of a weird term, but certainly there's a gender dimension to vulnerability, particularly among renters. And she gives the numbers there as being really quite significant. And Edith and Kristine may want to comment upon that in a minute. I want to come back to this point about, you mentioned just the collective consortium, and ask both of you, talk a little bit about the security the security that renters can and landlords can attain through having some sort of formal contracts. I know this is something that in Alan Gilbert and the IDB's work is one of the suggestions they make about not only just thinking about how can you make more secure and less vulnerable renters, but also how can you, as an incentive to landlords, provide them with some security as well in terms if they need to evict. But that's not really the point of my question. I'm kind of intrigued by the sort of papers or the sort of mechanisms whereby contracts could be provided. And Edith, you talked about what was it? The condominium model. I'd be really interested to know how the condominium model works in the context of trying to provide this sort of security, both to owners, but also to renters potentially. And then Kristine, you just talked about collective consumption and so forth. But what contracts exist in the different levels, the different types of housing? I assume they're minimal in terms of family plus, and then, as you mentioned, increasingly when you get to the collective consortium and the duress flip, which is essentially middle income apartments. So what sort of contracting exists for renting in the two contexts?
I would say that it's still very informal and covert, right? And so when you get down the line to the duress flip, it's really sort of like when I use this term, a deal you can't refuse. So on one hand, it's quite compelling in terms of the model, but it's highly problematic because it is imparting these power asymmetries, embedding those into the built environment. So I would say that it's something to really watch over the next years, but in terms of a formal contract and how that can be protective, I don't see how that could happen in an equitable way with that particular model. Again, when we look at the actual, just if we were to be, kind of formalists here, and we just looked at the building, yeah, it's an interesting model. But in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, it's a model that needs to be really thought out in terms of the contracts.
But I assume in the duress flip, it's a buyout, and then I assume the new construction, I assume is with full contracts for apartment renters, correct?
So it's a full buyout, a cash buyout, and then a rental accommodation for 6 months, and then this unit. So in terms of how the unit is, how that works in terms of a contract, I don't have that information.
Indeed.
No, I don't think. Well, the condominium is only for owners. For example, if the son or the daughter builds another unit, that unit would be on the original owner. That would be a condominium, but it's only on property. But it's nothing to do with renters or tenants. And the contracts, well, we can see, I showed that it was only 60-something% that had formal contract, but it's a formal contract that you buy in the corner street and both parts sign. It can be legal, but it's very much, as we said, as we or these contracts in these places take place, like trust. And sometimes this trust fails, and see who's stronger, the tenant or the owner. But what I worry about legalizing renting. I know that it's necessary, and Kristine has mentioned a couple of times that we have to look at the ethical side of it. It's horrible that a single mother with 3 kids, small kids, have to share a horrible house. But that is the only thing that they have. And if some policy comes, one clever politician comes and say, oh, this is horrible, let's make it better, the most likely thing to happen is that that woman is going to be kicked out. So how do we balance these conditions of renting? I think is very delicate, very, very delicate. If the ownership is delicate, the question about the vulnerable people living in very bad habitability conditions, precarious conditions, is even worse. And I haven't seen, I've read them, I've seen them, I asked them, people, and I haven't got an answer to that. I mean, either you make the right conditions for them to be sacked and then find another horrible place to live, or what do you do? Because you don't have enough money to support so many people that are in very low income conditions.
Other questions and comments from colleagues?
I have a question for Edith. It's a more general question I was kind of surprised by one of the numbers you gave at the beginning. And if you have any idea or any hypothesis of why rental is going down in Mexico more generally, not on this consolidated settlements, but Felipe Link is gonna talk about the Chilean case in March, but kind of a spoiler to his presentation is that renting is going up. So just was interested in this difference.
Well, from 2000, at the end of 1990s in Mexico, there was a lot of housing for sale put in the market. And there were times when 1 million houses were built a year. So could you imagine over 20 years, even if that amount went to half, it's a lot of houses. That doesn't mean that they're all paid. I mean, they have 30 years to pay, but they count as properties and not as rental houses. That's why as a general counting, the owners have gone up and the rent is down, but in these areas, in the low-income settlements, is the other tendency.
Good catch, Francisca, because I must say I saw that and I thought, well, here we all are arguing that renting is increasing in Latin American cities, particularly in consolidated settlements, and there you see a drop. And I think you've explained why that is. It's this mass increase in terms of these mass housing estates. Yeah. Let me ask the two of you, because I'm intrigued that when we do work in informal settlements, we're usually looking for owners, and that's a fairly straightforward process of knocking on doors, sampling, and so forth. But finding renters to interview can be extremely challenging. And indeed, if you find them, they can be very reticent about responding to questions because they feel, they are short term, but also specifically they're worried about retribution from their landlords. So it becomes very, very difficult to sort of systematically sample and interview people. So my question to both of you is, as researchers who've had to confront this this difficulty, and to the extent that you've been able to get around it, is it just pure serendipity and you get lucky, as Kristine was sort of saying, in terms of finding there's a person in the house who is a renter? What are the strategies that one could do to try and identify renters? Clearly, you see a number of meters on the outside wall. That's pretty indicative of sharing going on, or some sort of sharing going on. But even then, when you knock on the door, it's tough to get people to respond. So your ideas to future researchers, I know Felipe will be interested in your response to this, because that's what he's currently doing in Santiago de Chile. So over to you. How do you crack this?
Kristine, you go first. Or?
Okay. I think the survey instrument was very helpful because it was multimodal and therefore required multiple people. So we had, and we were mostly women. And so we were this group of women, walking around the settlement for months. And I think people got used to us. So there was a trust building that had happened. We also started the project with many focus groups. And so people, knew we were around to begin with, and then we may be knocking on their doors. So that helped. But in terms of just the normalization of rental, when I first did field work as a Fulbrighter, this was in 2008, I did have the experience of, when I would ask about rental, people really not wanting to talk about it. But I think in consolidated settlements where there's so much rental happening, it's when you're walking on the street, you can see these, basically corridors of rental. In consolidated settlements, it's a much more normalized process. People may not, just like any other city in the world right now, most cities, new construction is rental housing. So if you look at general contractors and development companies in New York City, for example, they're not building condos anymore. They're building really nice rental housing. And so that normalization of rental in our culture, I think, definitely helped, because we didn't come across the sort of hesitation of talking about rents, talking about landlords, talking about other people in the building who were also renters, or that the landlord lived in the building. Again, the survey instrument was very long. We were probably on each property for at least an hour. So we're talking a really intensive, discursive, data heavy, a long transaction. and I think that helped. I don't know what the outcome would be if it were a quick survey, if it were just going to the door, taking a survey and leaving. But we got inside. I think maybe on very few instances where we denied photos on the inside of a house, I would say maybe less than 10%. So I think it was a mix of factors, from the survey team to the length of the survey to the length of time in the settlement. And also just looking around for the signs, the infrastructure on the outside of the house. It's very obvious that settlements they're infrastructured for rent today, at least in the consolidated, very dense settlements close to the center.
Well, I would say yes, that surveys are very useful. I think that was the way that we got more information. But as Kristine says, if you arrive and just ask the questions in the questionnaire, it's not going to take you very far. You have to use the questionnaire just to start breaking the ice, and from there starting to get more information. But that was only for houses or even flats. But I would say that the most difficult was the people that live in rooms. That was amazingly difficult. People don't give information, and one of my students that are used to working with people, and they are very dedicated and very good for rapport with the people. They were able to talk to some, but they were always nervous. What if the landlord comes? What if the husband comes? What if my younger boy comes? They are very, very scared about talking. And we got very few information from people renting rooms. The other ones a bit open, but tenements are also difficult. Yeah. For landlords and for renters, because some people also think that they're going to that you're disguising as someone else, and you want you are the government and you're going to charge them if they are the owners. And also they say, well, what do you want to know? Why do you want to know? So it's difficult. For us, it was very useful to introduce ourselves as people from the university, and that opened a lot of doors.
Very good. One of the things. Sorry, go ahead, Kristine.
I was just going to add. So we also had a video that we made for the UN Habitat Conference in Quito, and we made it in Spanish in English and Portuguese, and so we could also just send people to the project website, and they could watch the video and understand a little bit what we were doing and why we were doing it. That also helped a bit.
I was going to say, add in my own suggestions. I used to get in, not trouble, but I used to have one of the big arguments I used to have with other directors from city directors within the land was the idea of paying for interviews. I was in favor, and I've had considerable success both in Latin America, but also in Colonia's work in Texas in terms of payment. But my colleagues tended to balk at that, and so we had a lot of discussion. And at the end of the day, we decided that each director would do whatever he wished. But one of the things, the ways I think, and particularly, Edith is talking about that, the very, very poor living in the tenements, female-headed households and so forth often, is to pay but not on site, because that doesn't get around the problems you've talked about. Is essentially to organize focus groups, advertise focus groups for renters, for particular constituencies of renters, and pay them $10 or whatever, which would be a considerable amount for an hour and a half. Not only to conduct the focus group, but then to do the follow-up. You can do follow-up meetings, again, maybe paid for in terms of one-on-one interviews and so forth, where you can get all those sorts of insights. So you sort of start with the focus group contact and then try and work backwards if possible. I put that out as a possibility if you have the resources to do it, and if you're disposed to paying for people's time, as I always have been.
Also, you know what? Through organizations, that also works all right, and through the church, different churches.
That's a very good suggestion. Non-governmental organization. But again, you're working with a prime contact person, either in the NGO or the priest, and then you're working through them. But as I say, that would be a very good way of populating focus groups as well. So I think one has to think very imaginatively, but it is going to be, if you're just knocking on doors, it's going to be very serendipitous and end in tears, probably your own tears, because you'll end up getting very frustrated. And we have a few minutes left if anyone else wishes to have comments or raise questions. Okay.
Just one comment I would like to say is that one of the things that we might be looking in these consolidated settlements, it's the gentrification of the settlements. I was talking to Jessie Reveles, that it's here, one of doctorate student, and she said, I asked her about Rancho Nuevo, where we are doing our research, and she said it's very expensive now. We have to look at the neighboring settlement. So and in another settlement, I had the same comment from my students. So that's something that is happening as well.
That's a really important point. It's definitely happening in the context of Sao Paulo. So Jake Wegman and I did a pro forma on the duress flip versus the family type for a conference in 2020. So happy to share that paper for those interested in the microeconomics of rental processes.
Yeah, that's one of the problems why you know the market, housing market, is actually quite what Edith talked about as being stagnant. It's not as much stagnant. There is the demand there. Well, there's the supply there potentially, but there's no demand because really few people can afford the buyouts. The only people who can do the buyouts are people who want to establish a commercial development or middle income groups who are going to tear down and build in terms of the gentrification. Anne Varley at a conference we once had in Texas talked about gentrification, talked about pocket gentrification. Mm-hmm. What she meant by that was pocket in the sense of some settlements which are particularly well located are more likely to be gentrified than others or see gentrification. Yeah. But then even within that, these settlements are often quite large. And although these middle income or even apartment high-rise developments are very noticeable, they're really a small number. So it's almost also pocket gentrification within these settlements. So we saw some examples today, I think, in both presentations. But when people talk about gentrification, it sometimes worries me that the thought that these areas are being totally turned over to gentrification, because you know, that just doesn't seem to be the case in my view. Well, let's leave it there. And I just simply want to close out and thank today's speakers, Kristine, Stiphany, and Edith Jimenez, for their really wonderful, interesting presentations. Thank you all for joining us today. This, as you know, this is being recorded and will be made available to you within a week or so. So you can come back and look at it, and others who weren't able to join us will be able to view the video. I saw a note saying something about the questioning whether there was a text to go with it. We can provide the text, but often it's on Zoom. It's not terribly helpful. So, but we'll take a look at that and see if we can tidy it up on your behalf. Our next presentation is March the 16th. It's Dr. Felipe Link from Santiago de Chile. Felipe is there. Thank you for joining us today as well, Felipe. We look forward to hearing about the allegados and other mobility patterns in Santiago de Chile. That's on March the 16th, which will be the third in this series of rental housing in Latin America. So without further ado, I'm going to stop the recording.